April 1945. Above ground, Berlin was dying. Entire city blocks burned without interruption as Soviet artillery pounded the German capital day and night. Buildings that had stood for centuries collapsed into mountains of broken brick and twisted steel. Streets disappeared beneath rubble so deep that tanks struggled to move through them. Telephone poles leaned at impossible angles. Tram lines hung uselessly across shattered intersections, and every hour brought another wave of explosions that shook the city from end to end. More than 2 million Soviet soldiers were closing in from every direction, determined to capture the heart of the Third Reich, yet nearly 50 feet beneath the devastated streets. Inside a maze of reinforced concrete rooms hidden beneath the Reich Chancellery garden, Adolf Hitler continued directing a war that Germany had already lost. This underground complex, known as the Führerbunker, would become the last operational headquarters of Nazi Germany. It was here, cut off from reality by layers of concrete and surrounded by a shrinking circle of loyal followers, that the Third Reich would spend its final days. To understand why Hitler ended the war beneath Berlin rather than at one of his famous military headquarters, it is necessary to go back several months. For most of the war, Hitler had directed military operations from large command complexes scattered across occupied Europe. The most famous of these was the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, a sprawling headquarters hidden deep within dense forests and protected by multiple security zones, minefields, anti-aircraft batteries, and thousands of guards. From there, Hitler had overseen the invasions of the Soviet Union, planned massive offensives, and received generals from every corner of Europe. The Wolf's Lair reflected confidence. It symbolized a dictatorship that believed it would rule the continent for generations. By late 1944, that confidence had vanished. The Soviet army had advanced relentlessly across Eastern Europe, while Allied forces pushed steadily toward Germany from the west. East Prussia itself no longer appeared secure. Soviet artillery would soon threaten regions once considered untouchable. In November 1944, Hitler abandoned the Wolf's Lair forever. The retreat itself carried symbolic significance. For the first time since the war began, the FHR was leaving one of his great military headquarters not because victory required movement, but because defeat demanded escape. His final destination would be Berlin. The bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery had existed for years, though originally in much simpler form. Construction of an air raid shelter beneath the Chancellery began during the late 1930s as tensions across Europe increased. After the outbreak of war, engineers expanded the underground facilities considerably. Eventually, the complex consisted of two connected sections. The upper shelter, often called the bunker, sat closer to the surface and provided protection against ordinary air raids. Below it lay the deeper Führerbunker, completed in 1944 and designed to withstand direct bomb impacts through massive reinforced concrete walls, several meters thick. The engineering reflected Germany's remarkable expertise in bunker construction. The lower complex rested approximately 15 meters beneath ground level. Thick concrete ceilings protected occupants from heavy bombing, while reinforced walls resisted blast pressure. Steel doors separated different sections of the bunker, helping isolate damage if explosions penetrated any particular area. Air filtration systems attempted to protect against smoke and chemical attacks. Powerful pumps constantly removed groundwater that naturally seeped into the structure because much of Berlin sat close to the water table. Without continuous pumping, portions of the bunker would gradually flood, despite its military appearance. The Führerbunker remained surprisingly small compared with many people imagine today. Popular films often depict enormous underground corridors stretching endlessly beneath Berlin. The historical reality proved far more modest. Narrow hallways connected a series of relatively compact rooms. Hitler's personal quarters occupied only a limited portion of the complex. Nearby stood conference rooms, communications offices, bedrooms for secretaries, storage areas, kitchens, mechanical rooms, and living quarters for selected staff members. Every available space served a specific purpose because underground construction remained expensive and technically difficult. The bunker had never been intended as a permanent residence originally. It represented an emergency refuge where government leaders could continue functioning during bombing raids before returning above ground once attacks ended. By early 1945, however, circumstances transformed this temporary shelter into the operational headquarters of a collapsing empire. Hitler arrived permanently on January 16, 1945, outside. Berlin still functioned, though under increasing strain. Air raids had become routine. Refugees crowded railway stations after fleeing Soviet advances in the east. Food shortages worsened each week. Yet many ordinary Germans continued believing somehow the situation might improve. Official propaganda insisted that miracle weapons would soon change the course of the war. Newspapers described heroic resistance and promised eventual victory despite mounting evidence to the contrary. Underground. Daily life settled into an increasingly isolated routine. Hitler rarely left a bunker after January except for brief walks through the Reich Chancellery garden accompanied by his beloved German shepherd, Blondie. Fresh air became an unusual experience. Most hours passed beneath artificial lighting inside rooms where thick concrete blocked every hint of sunlight. Visitors frequently remarked upon the atmosphere. The bunker smelled of machinery, cigarette smoke, damp concrete, and stale air despite constant ventilation. Electrical generators hummed continuously in the background. Telephones rang at all hours. Typewriters echoed through narrow corridors as secretaries prepared military orders and dictated correspondence. Staff members quickly lost all sense of natural day and night because electric lights remained illuminated almost constantly. The environment affected everyone living there, unlike soldiers fighting at the front. Bunker occupants experienced the war indirectly through reports, maps, telephone conversations, and the distant rumble of bombs striking Berlin above them. Days blended together. Many individuals developed irregular sleeping habits. Some remained awake until dawn before attempting rest during daylight hours, while others worked according to Hitler's increasingly unusual schedule. Hitler himself had always preferred late nights. As the war deteriorated, this tendency became even more pronounced. Military conferences often began during the afternoon and continued deep into the night. Dinner rarely occurred before midnight. Important discussions sometimes lasted until 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. Secretaries adapted by sleeping whenever possible between assignments. These routines gradually isolated bunker personnel from ordinary reality above ground. Berlin civilians struggled daily against bombardment, collapsing infrastructure, and growing shortages. Underground, clocks still functioned, meals appeared regularly, and telephones connected Hitler directly with military headquarters scattered across Germany. The contrast became increasingly surreal. As the front lines approached the capital itself, the bunker housed a surprisingly diverse collection of people. Military officers arrived carrying maps and operational reports. Secretaries typed endless orders. Telephone operators maintained communications with field headquarters. Doctors monitored Hitler's health. Cooks prepared meals despite dwindling supplies. Mechanics maintained generators and ventilation equipment. Security personnel guarded entrances around the clock. Among Hitler's closest staff stood Martin Bormann, head of the Nazi Party Chancellery and one of the most influential men inside the Third Reich. Bormann controlled access to Hitler with extraordinary efficiency. Anyone wishing to speak privately with the FHR often required Bormann's approval first. Over time, this administrative control granted him immense political influence because information reaching Hitler frequently passed through his hands. Nearby worked Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, who remained fiercely loyal despite Germany's worsening situation. Unlike several other senior Nazi officials who gradually distanced themselves from Berlin, Goebbels moved into the bunker with his wife Magda and eventually even their 6 children. His presence reflected complete personal commitment to Hitler until the very end. Hitler's military adjutants occupied adjoining offices. They coordinated conferences, transmitted orders, organized visitors, and attempted to maintain increasingly fragile communications with armies scattered across collapsing fronts. Every day brought fresh reports describing lost cities, destroyed divisions, or failed counterattacks. Communications formed the nervous system of the bunker. Radio operators supplemented landlines increasingly disrupted by bombing and advancing Soviet forces. Couriers still carried important documents physically when electronic communication became unreliable. Every message entering the bunker possessed enormous significance. Hitler demanded constant updates concerning troop movements, ammunition supplies, fuel stocks, and weather conditions. Large military maps covered conference room tables where colored pins represented divisions that often existed only on paper. Officers moved these markers according to the latest reports, creating visual representations of fronts stretching hundreds of kilometers beyond Berlin. Yet these maps increasingly concealed rather than revealed reality. Many German divisions had suffered catastrophic losses while retaining their original designations. A formation officially listed as a division might actually consist of only several hundred exhausted soldiers with few heavy weapons remaining. Fuel shortages immobilized armored units. Ammunition shortages limited artillery operations. Communications failures delayed accurate reporting. Consequently, maps often appeared far stronger than actual battlefield conditions justified. This discrepancy would become one of the defining characteristics of Hitler's final headquarters. Inside conference rooms, arrows indicated ambitious counterattacks. Colored symbols suggested organized defensive lines. Reinforcements appeared available according to paperwork. Outside those rooms, entire armies struggled simply to survive another day. Hitler nevertheless insisted upon maintaining strict routines. Every afternoon, senior officers gathered for military conferences discussing the latest operational developments. Participants included generals responsible for different fronts, adjutants, and selected political officials. Maps covered tables, while officers summarized reports arriving from across Germany. Initially, these meetings retained elements of professional military planning. Commanders discussed logistics, reserves, weather, and transportation. Gradually, the discussions changed. Instead of debating how to achieve victory, conferences increasingly focused upon delaying inevitable defeat. Yet Hitler refused to acknowledge that distinction openly. He continued demanding offensives from units lacking fuel. He ordered divisions to hold positions after they had already been destroyed. He insisted non-existent reserves would soon arrive. Many generals recognized the impossibility of these commands, but rarely challenged him directly. The psychological atmosphere inside the bunker grew steadily more oppressive. Everyone understood Germany faced disaster. Few dared say so openly. Several senior officers attempted presenting realistic assessments during conferences. Hitler frequently interrupted them angrily. Reports emphasizing enemy strength irritated him. He preferred hearing optimistic interpretations even when evidence contradicted such conclusions. This tendency gradually distorted decision-making. Military staff learned that presenting unpleasant realities risked provoking emotional outbursts. Consequently, some reports became increasingly cautious or selective. No deliberate conspiracy existed to deceive Hitler completely. Rather, human nature encouraged subordinates to soften bad news while emphasizing any remaining positive developments. The bunker itself reinforced this isolation. Thick concrete walls separated occupants from visible evidence of destruction. Bomb explosions remained audible, sometimes shaking dust from ceilings, but daily devastation unfolding across Berlin remained largely unseen. Occasionally visitors arriving from outside described burning neighborhoods, endless refugee columns, or Soviet artillery shells landing ever closer to the city center. For a few moments reality entered the bunker. Then conference doors closed again, maps unfolded, orders were dictated, telephones rang, the machinery of government continued operating beneath a capital that was gradually ceasing to exist. Hitler's personal habits also evolved during these months. Observers noted increasing physical deterioration. He walked slowly, often with a noticeable tremor affecting his left hand. His posture became stooped. Concentration sometimes wandered during lengthy conferences. Doctors continued prescribing numerous medications intended to maintain energy, relieve digestive problems, and address chronic pain. Exactly how these treatments influenced Hitler's judgment remains debated among historians, but nearly everyone present recognized that he no longer resembled the energetic political leader who had dominated Germany during the 193 years. Nevertheless, his authority inside the bunker remained absolute. Orders issued from underground headquarters still directed armies containing hundreds of thousands of soldiers, railway movements, industrial production, civilian evacuations, and military operations all depended upon decisions made inside these narrow concrete corridors. For as long as communications remained intact, the Führerbunker functioned as the operational heart of Nazi Germany. Yet with every passing day, Soviet forces moved closer. The thunder of artillery gradually became louder. Electrical lights flickered more frequently as Berlin's infrastructure suffered additional damage. Telephone connections failed with increasing regularity. Reports arrived describing enemy troops crossing rivers once considered secure defensive barriers. What had begun as a protected command center was slowly transforming into a fortress surrounded by an enemy that could no longer be stopped. The bunker had been built to protect Germany's leadership from bombs. It had never been designed to protect them from the consequences of their own decisions. as the walls of Hitler's last operational headquarters continued to stand firm against artillery and air raids. The military situation beyond those walls collapsed with astonishing speed. Soon, even the thickest reinforced concrete in Europe would no longer be able to separate the FHR from the reality advancing toward him through the shattered streets of Berlin. By February 1945, the illusion that Berlin could somehow escape the fate of the rest of Germany had almost completely disappeared. Soviet armies had crossed the Oder River in several places, placing them less than 70 kilometers from the capital. To the west, American and British forces continued driving deeper into Germany with astonishing speed. Every day brought new reports of bridges captured intact, industrial regions abandoned, and entire German formations retreating under relentless pressure. Yet inside the Führerbunker, Hitler continued conducting military conferences as though enough reserves still existed to reverse the situation. The concrete walls surrounding the headquarters insulated those inside from the physical destruction above, but they could not stop the flow of increasingly disastrous military reports arriving by telephone and courier. The daily routine inside the bunker became almost ritualistic. Hitler normally awoke late in the morning, after sleeping only a few hours. His nights had grown progressively longer as the war deteriorated. Secretaries often remained awake until dawn typing orders dictated after midnight, while adjutants struggled to organize meetings according to a schedule that ignored the normal rhythm of day and night. Breakfast usually consisted of a simple vegetarian meal. Hitler had avoided meat for years, believing vegetarianism benefited both his health and his moral image. His cooks prepared modest dishes despite the extraordinary circumstances surrounding the bunker. After breakfast came the first military briefings. General staff officers entered the conference room carrying folders filled with situation reports gathered overnight. Large operational maps remained spread across tables almost permanently. Colored pencils marked the latest Soviet advances, while small flags and symbols identified German divisions attempting to block them. During earlier years of the war, these maps had displayed sweeping offensives stretching across entire continents. Now the focus narrowed steadily toward Germany itself. Hitler examined every report carefully. He asked detailed questions about individual units, road junctions, bridges, rivers, and ammunition supplies. His memory for military geography remained remarkably sharp. Officers frequently recalled that he could remember obscure villages discussed months earlier or identify railway lines from memory without consulting maps. Yet something fundamental had changed. Hitler increasingly interpreted information according to what he believed should happen rather than what was actually occurring. When reports described Soviet breakthroughs, he searched immediately for opportunities to launch counterattacks. If commanders explained that no reserves remained available, Hitler often insisted they simply had not looked hard enough. If officers reported fuel shortages, he demanded that transportation officials solve the problem immediately, even when no fuel existed to distribute. This pattern became increasingly common. Reality no longer shaped Hitler's decisions. Instead, decisions increasingly attempted to reshape reality. One conference after another followed the same basic sequence. Staff officers summarized battlefield developments. Generals explained deteriorating conditions. Hitler interrupted with increasingly ambitious plans requiring forces that no longer existed. Silence usually followed. Few senior officers openly challenged him. Those who did often discovered that disagreement produced little practical result. Hitler remained convinced that Germany's greatest problem was not enemy superiority, but insufficient determination among his commanders. This belief became central to his thinking during the final months of the war. Throughout his political career, Hitler had often attributed success to willpower rather than material strength. He believed determined leadership could overcome disadvantages in numbers, equipment, or geography. During Germany's early victories, this philosophy appeared validated. Bold decisions had indeed produced spectacular results in Poland, France, and the early stages of Operation Barbarossa. By 1945. However, circumstances had changed completely. The Soviet Union now possessed overwhelming numerical superiority. American industry produced aircraft, tanks, trucks, and ammunition faster than Germany could destroy them. Fuel production had collapsed, rail networks lay in ruins, entire cities had become battlefields. In no amount of determination could manufacture gasoline or replace destroyed armored divisions. Many professional officers understood this. Hitler refused to accept it, One of the most controversial aspects of life inside the bunker involved the growing gap between operational reports and battlefield reality. Army commanders occasionally requested permission to withdraw from exposed positions to avoid encirclement. Professional military doctrine generally supported such withdrawals when they preserved combat strength. Hitler increasingly rejected them. He issued hold at all costs orders requiring units to defend positions regardless of tactical circumstances. The consequences proved devastating. German divisions trapped by Soviet encirclements often fought until ammunition disappeared. Thousands died or entered captivity because retreat had been forbidden. From Hitler's perspective, every withdrawal encouraged further retreat. From the perspective of many generals, refusing organized withdrawals simply accelerated military collapse. The disagreements grew sharper with every passing week. General Heinz Guderian, Germany's Inspector General of Armored Troops and one of the architects of Blitzkrieg doctrine, became one of Hitler's most outspoken critics during these conferences. Guderian argued repeatedly that Germany needed flexible defensive operations rather than rigid resistance. He attempted presenting realistic assessments based upon available manpower and equipment. Hitler often responded angrily. Meetings between the two men became increasingly tense. Witnesses recalled raised voices echoing through the bunker conference room as Germany's political leader argued with one of its most experienced armored commanders. Their disagreements reflected two completely different understandings of warfare. Guderian believed military decisions should follow operational realities. Hitler believed operational realities should submit to political determination. Eventually, the relationship deteriorated beyond repair. In March 1945, after another heated confrontation, Guderian was effectively removed from active participation, officially for medical reasons. His departure eliminated one of the few senior officers still willing to challenge Hitler directly. As experienced commanders disappeared, the bunker grew increasingly isolated. Many officers remaining nearby understood the futility of further arguments. Instead, they focused on implementing whatever orders emerged from the daily conferences. Regardless of personal opinion, Martin Bormann watched these developments carefully. Although not a military commander, Bormann exercised extraordinary influence inside the bunker through his control over administrative affairs. He managed schedules, correspondence, and access to Hitler. Every visitor, every memorandum, every request for an audience passed through his office. Historians continue debating exactly how much Bormann influenced Hitler's decisions. What remains clear is that his administrative position granted him enormous power during the Third Reich's final months. Joseph Goebbels played a different role. Unlike many officials whose confidence weakened as Germany collapsed, Goebbels remained unwaveringly loyal. He continued believing that history would judge steadfastness more favorably than compromise. Even as Soviet artillery approached Berlin, Goebbels devoted enormous effort to propaganda broadcasts encouraging civilians and soldiers to continue resisting inside the bunker. He frequently attempted lifting morale through confident speeches, predicting unexpected political developments that might yet divide the Allies. Some hoped disagreements between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union would somehow produce separate peace negotiations. Others imagined new weapons might alter the battlefield. These hopes grew increasingly detached from military reality. Nevertheless, they persisted. Life underground became psychologically exhausting. The bunker never remained truly quiet. Ventilation systems operated constantly. Telephones rang day and night. Typewriters clattered endlessly. Messengers hurried through narrow corridors carrying reports requiring immediate attention. Occasionally, the entire complex shuddered as heavy bombs exploded nearby. Glass drifted from ceilings despite the bunker's immense structural strength. The sound reminded everyone that Berlin above them continued disappearing piece by piece. Fresh air became increasingly rare. Most occupants spent weeks underground without meaningful exposure to daylight. Artificial lighting illuminated every corridor regardless of the hour. Many individuals gradually lost any instinctive awareness of time. Meals, conferences, and work schedules became the only reliable indicators separating one day from another. The atmosphere affected health as well. Doctors noted increasing fatigue among bunker personnel. Sleep proved irregular. Stress remained constant. Smoking became almost continuous despite Hitler's personal dislike of tobacco. The confined environment magnified every personal conflict because privacy barely existed. Hitler's own health visibly deteriorated. Observers consistently described a pronounced tremor affecting his left hand. His movements appeared slower. He often leaned heavily on furniture while walking. His complexion grew pale from months without regular sunlight. Several eyewitnesses remarked that he seemed to age dramatically during the first months of 1945. His physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, continued administering a complicated mixture of medications intended to relieve digestive problems, improve energy, and treat various chronic ailments. Eventually, however, Hitler lost confidence in Morell's treatments. By April, Morell had largely fallen from favor and soon departed Berlin. Medical historians continue debating how much Hitler's physical condition influenced his decision-making. The surviving evidence suggests gradual decline rather than sudden incapacity. Mentally, Hitler remained capable of recalling enormous quantities of information and discussing military matters in detail. The greater problem lay in his refusal to accept conclusions contradicting his expectations. As military conferences grew more detached from battlefield realities, communications themselves began failing. Bomb damage repeatedly interrupted telephone lines connecting Berlin with headquarters across Germany. Radio transmissions suffered interference. Couriers increasingly risked their lives traveling through areas under constant air attack. Information reached the bunker more slowly and often incompletely. This uncertainty encouraged rumor. Reports circulated describing divisions preparing major counterattacks. Others claimed entire Soviet armies had been halted. Still others insisted American and British forces intended to break their alliance with Stalin. Most of these stories proved exaggerated or entirely false, yet in an environment dominated by hope rather than evidence, rumors acquired surprising influence. Hitler clung particularly to the possibility of a decisive counterstroke. He became convinced that certain formations still possessed the strength to strike Soviet spearheads unexpectedly. Maps inside the conference room reflected these hopes. Arrows indicated planned offensives. Circles highlighted assembly areas. Timetables projected movements that often ignored fuel shortages, destroyed bridges, or missing personnel. Professional officers quietly recognized that many formations existed more on paper than in reality. Some divisions reported thousands of soldiers despite fielding only a few hundred exhausted men. Armored units, officially listing dozens of tanks, sometimes possessed fewer than 10 operational vehicles. Fuel shortages immobilized even those, yet official designations remained unchanged. Consequently, the maps conveyed an illusion of military capability no longer supported by actual combat strength. One of the most revealing aspects of bunker life involved Hitler's relationship with the outside world. He rarely witnessed Berlin directly. Occasional walks through the Reich Chancellery garden became increasingly dangerous as artillery shells landed closer to the government district. Even these brief excursions eventually stopped. From then onward, Hitler's understanding of events depended almost entirely upon reports delivered by others. This isolation fundamentally altered leadership. Commanders at the front experienced destruction firsthand. They saw broken equipment, exhausted soldiers, burning villages, and advancing enemy columns. Hitler experienced colored symbols moving across paper maps. The difference mattered enormously. Military decisions increasingly reflected abstraction rather than observation. Several visitors later remarked upon the strange contrast. Above ground, Berlin resembled a landscape from another world. Smoke covered the skyline. Buildings burned continuously. Refugees pushed carts through shattered streets, searching desperately for shelter. Below ground, conference rooms remained orderly, maps hung neatly, orders were typed in precise format. Meals arrived according to schedule. The bureaucracy of the Third Reich continued functioning with astonishing efficiency, despite the collapse occurring only meters overhead. This surreal separation could not last indefinitely. By early April, artillery fire became almost continuous. Electricity occasionally flickered. Water systems required constant maintenance. Security officers reported Soviet reconnaissance units approaching Berlin's outer defenses. Every new military briefing described shrinking German territory. The capital itself was becoming the battlefield. The bunker had originally served as a shelter from bombing raids. Now it faced something far more dangerous. The enemy was no longer flying overhead. It was advancing street by street toward the Reich Chancellery itself, inside Hitler's last operational headquarters. The daily conferences continued. Orders were still issued, and maps were still updated with careful precision. But the circle of German-controlled territory surrounding Berlin was shrinking so rapidly that every decision made underground had less practical effect than the one before it. The bunker remained intact, yet the military machine it commanded was disintegrating. Soon, Hitler would pin his remaining hopes on a single counterattack that existed more in imagination than on the battlefield, a decision that would expose just how completely the Führerbunker had become a world separated from the reality unfolding above its concrete ceiling. By the middle of April 1945, the Führerbunker had become more than a military headquarters. It had become the final refuge of an entire political regime. The vast empire that Adolf Hitler had promised would endure for 1,000 years had been reduced to a handful of underground rooms beneath the Reich Chancellery. Every day, the Soviet army pushed deeper into Berlin. Every hour, artillery shells landed closer to the government district. Telephone connections disappeared one after another as streets were torn apart by explosions. Yet inside the bunker, Hitler still insisted that the situation could be reversed if only one final counterattack succeeded. That counterattack centered on General Felix Steiner. Steiner commanded what remained of Army Detachment Steiner, a force that on paper appeared capable of striking the exposed flank of the advancing Soviet armies. Hitler convinced himself that Steiner could launch a decisive offensive north of Berlin, cutting into Soviet formations and relieving the pressure on the capital. The reality could not have been more different. Steiner possessed only fragments of several shattered units. Many of his soldiers had no armored support whatsoever. Fuel shortages prevented meaningful movement. Ammunition stocks were critically low. Communications between formations had largely broken down. Some battalions existed only as names on organizational charts. Others had fewer than 100 effective soldiers. Steiner understood immediately that the operation ordered by Hitler could not be carried out. He simply lacked the men, the tanks, and the fuel. As reports reached Berlin confirming that the attack had not begun. Tension inside the bunker rose dramatically. On April 22nd, Hitler summoned another military conference. It would become one of the most famous meetings of the entire Second World War. Senior officers gathered around the familiar map table. General Alfred Jodl, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Hans Krebs, Wilhelm Bergdorf, Martin Bormann, and several adjutants waited as the latest reports were presented. When Hitler learned that Steiner had not attacked, something inside him appeared to break. Witnesses later described an explosion of anger unlike anything they had previously seen. Hitler accused his generals of betrayal. He declared that the German army had failed him. He insisted every sacrifice made during the war had been wasted because military commanders lacked the courage to obey orders. His voice reportedly rose until it echoed through the bunker corridors. Those present remained silent. Some stared at the floor, others avoided eye contact entirely. The outburst lasted several minutes before Hitler collapsed into a chair, exhausted both physically and emotionally. Then came words that stunned nearly everyone in the room. For the first time, Hitler openly admitted that the war was lost. He declared that Germany had been defeated. He stated that he would remain in Berlin rather than flee south, if necessary. He said he would take his own life rather than allow himself to be captured. The conference ended in near silence. Many officers left realizing that the Third Reich had entered its final chapter. The atmosphere inside the bunker changed almost immediately. Until that moment, at least some officials had still hoped Hitler might leave Berlin and establish another headquarters somewhere in southern Germany or Austria. Plans had existed for a so-called Alpine Redoubt, a mountainous defensive region where remaining German forces might continue resistance. Modern historians generally agree that the Alpine Redoubt was greatly exaggerated and never possessed the military strength claimed by Nazi propaganda. Nevertheless, many believed Hitler might attempt to relocate there. His decision to remain in Berlin eliminated that possibility. The bunker was no longer a command center preparing future operations. It had become a place awaiting the inevitable. Despite this realization, military conferences continued. Maps still covered the tables. Orders continued flowing through the communications rooms. Telephone operators struggled to maintain contact with isolated headquarters as Soviet artillery destroyed exchange after exchange. Every successful connection became more valuable than the last. The staff worked almost continuously. Messengers raced through the corridors carrying updated reports. Secretaries typed orders destined for divisions that often no longer existed as organized fighting forces. The bureaucracy of the Third Reich continued functioning with remarkable discipline even as its authority disappeared. Above ground, Berlin had become an inferno. Soviet artillery fired tens of thousands of shells into the city every day. Entire districts vanished beneath smoke and rubble. Civilian casualties mounted rapidly. Hospitals overflowed. Water supplies failed in many neighborhoods. Electricity became increasingly unreliable. Thousands of Berlin residents crowded into subway tunnels and improvised shelters, hoping simply to survive another night. Inside the bunker, the distant thunder of artillery had become constant. Walls occasionally vibrated with nearby impacts, dust drifted from ceilings despite the enormous thickness of reinforced concrete. The sound no longer startled anyone. It had become part of everyday life. Fresh air had become almost non-existent. The ventilation system continued operating, but nothing could remove the smell of damp concrete, machinery, cigarette smoke, fuel, and human exhaustion. Many bunker occupants had not experienced ordinary daylight for weeks. Electric lamps remained illuminated continuously. Time lost much of its normal meaning. One day blended almost seamlessly into the next. Around this time, Hitler's longtime companion Eva Braun arrived permanently in the bunker. Unlike many senior officials who searched desperately for escape routes out of Berlin, Eva Braun chose to remain voluntarily. She had opportunities to leave. Friends urged her to flee south before Soviet forces surrounded the capital. She refused, according to numerous witnesses. She believed her place was beside Hitler regardless of the outcome. Eva Braun's presence introduced an unusual contrast into bunker life. While military officers discussed collapsing fronts and impossible counterattacks, she often attempted to maintain an atmosphere of normality. She dressed elegantly despite the circumstances. She spoke politely with secretaries and staff members. She occasionally organized small gatherings over coffee. Some survivors later remarked that she appeared remarkably calm considering the catastrophe unfolding above them. Whether this reflected genuine composure or deliberate optimism remains impossible to know. Hitler himself displayed increasingly contradictory behavior. Military conferences remained intense and often pessimistic. Yet outside those meetings, he occasionally discussed architecture, music, or his long-standing plans for rebuilding German cities after the war, a future that everyone around him understood would never exist. These conversations puzzled several witnesses. Some interpreted them as attempts to escape reality. Others believed Hitler simply found comfort in discussing subjects unrelated to military defeat. The bunker population continued growing. Joseph Goebbels and his wife Magda brought their 6 young children underground. The children, ranging from early childhood to adolescence, occupied separate rooms within the upper bunker. Staff members frequently encountered them playing quietly in corridors or reading books while artillery explosions echoed overhead. Their presence created one of the strangest contrasts within the headquarters. Only a few meters away, military leaders directed the final defense of Berlin. Nearby, children attempted to live ordinary lives beneath the collapsing capital. Goebbels himself remained absolutely loyal as propaganda minister. He had spent years portraying Hitler as Germany's indispensable leader. Now he chose to share Hitler's fate rather than abandon him. He continued drafting radio broadcasts and proclamations encouraging resistance, even though most transmission facilities had already fallen silent. Martin Bormann never left Hitler's side for long. He monitored communications, organized meetings, and supervised administrative matters with the same efficiency that had characterized his work throughout the war. Even during Germany's final days, Bormann maintained meticulous records and schedules. Several witnesses later commented that the machinery of administration continued functioning almost normally despite the extraordinary circumstances. Outside the bunker, however, military reality deteriorated by the hour. The Soviet army gradually surrounded central Berlin. Street fighting erupted. Only blocks from the Reich Chancellery, German defenders consisted increasingly of improvised formations. Regular army units fought beside Waffen-SS detachments, police battalions, Volkssturm militia, and members of the Hitler Youth. Many possessed little training. Some carried only a handful of anti-tank weapons. Others defended intersections with obsolete rifles against Soviet tanks supported by artillery and aircraft. The defenders fought with determination in many areas, but the outcome had become unavoidable. Inside the communications room, every incoming message seemed worse than the one before. Entire sectors stopped responding. Command posts disappeared without explanation. Officers marked lost positions on maps with increasing frequency. The red lines representing Soviet advances crept steadily toward the government district. General Hans Krebs attempted repeatedly to coordinate remaining defenses. As chief of the Army General Staff, he faced an impossible task. Communications collapsed. Reserves no longer existed. Every decision involved choosing which sector would receive the last available ammunition or the final operational armored vehicles. No solution could fundamentally change the situation. The bunker doctors also noticed Hitler's physical decline accelerating. Witnesses described him walking with short, shuffling steps. His hands trembled more noticeably. His face appeared grey and deeply lined. He often seemed physically exhausted after relatively short meetings, yet mentally he remained intensely engaged whenever military discussions began. He continued studying maps in remarkable detail. He remembered unit designations, commanders, and geographical features with impressive accuracy. The contradiction puzzled many observers. His memory remained sharp. His conclusions became increasingly detached from reality. As Soviet forces drew closer, security concerns intensified. Guards strengthened. Checkpoints leading into the bunker complex. Identification procedures became stricter. Entrances remained heavily protected despite the obvious fact that the greatest danger now came not from infiltrators but from the advancing Red Army itself. Every shell landing nearby reminded everyone that the enemy was only hundreds of meters away. Several bunker occupants quietly discussed escape. Some planned to break through Soviet lines toward Western Germany, hoping to surrender to American or British forces rather than the Soviets. Others doubted any escape remained possible. No organized evacuation plan existed. Each individual would ultimately make his or her own decision. Hitler, however, refused every suggestion that he leave Berlin. He believed departing the capital would symbolize cowardice, whether motivated by pride, fatalism, or political calculation. His decision remained unchanged. He would remain inside the Führerbunker until the end. The headquarters that had once directed armies across Europe now commanded little more than isolated pockets of resistance inside Berlin itself. Yet daily routines continued with surprising regularity. Meals were still served, reports were still typed, maps were still updated, military conferences still convened. The normal procedures of government persisted, even after the government had effectively ceased to function. This strange mixture of order and collapse defined life inside Hitler's last operational headquarters during its final week. Every person underground understood that Soviet soldiers would eventually reach the Reich Chancellery. No one knew precisely when. The uncertainty proved psychologically exhausting. Each explosion suggested the battle had moved even closer. Each failed telephone connection hinted that another headquarters had fallen. Each military briefing reduced Germany's remaining territory to an ever smaller area surrounding the bunker itself. Then, on April 28th, events outside Germany delivered another devastating blow. News reached Berlin that Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and one of Hitler's oldest and most powerful associates, had secretly attempted to negotiate surrender terms with the Western Allies without Hitler's knowledge or approval. To Hitler, this was not merely political betrayal, it was personal treason at the very moment he believed absolute loyalty mattered most. The revelation shattered what little trust remained within his shrinking inner circle and convinced him that even the men who had helped build the Third Reich were now abandoning it. As Soviet troops fought their way ever closer to the Reich Chancellery, the Führerbunker ceased to resemble a headquarters planning military operations and instead became a place where its occupants prepared for their own final decisions. Within 48 hours, Hitler would marry Eva Braun, dictate his political testament, and bring the history of Nazi Germany to its violent conclusion beneath the shattered streets of Berlin. The evening of April 28, 1945, settled over Berlin beneath a sky illuminated not by sunlight, but by thousands of artillery flashes. Soviet guns fired almost continuously into the government district, reducing entire blocks to shattered ruins. Inside the Führerbunker, the sound had become so familiar that few people even paused when the concrete walls trembled. Yet the psychological atmosphere had changed completely. For months, those living underground had spoken about military reverses, counterattacks, and dwindling resources. Now almost every conversation revolved around survival, loyalty, and what would happen after Hitler died. The final blow to Hitler's confidence came not from Soviet tanks, but from a radio report. News arrived that Heinrich Himmler, Reich's HRSS and one of Hitler's oldest political allies, had secretly attempted to open negotiations with the Western Allies through Count Vogt Bernadotte of Sweden. Himmler apparently believed Germany might secure more favorable surrender terms if it continued resisting the Soviet Union while making peace with Britain and the United States. Hitler. The report represented the ultimate betrayal for years. Himmler had presented himself as one of the FRE's most devoted followers. He commanded the SS, controlled vast security organizations, and had overseen some of the darkest chapters of Nazi rule. If even Himmler had concluded the war was lost, then Hitler believed the loyalty upon which his dictatorship depended had completely collapsed. Witnesses recalled Hitler reacting with cold fury. He ordered Himmler stripped of all offices and declared him a traitor to Germany. Another official soon became the target of Hitler's anger. Hermann Göring, once designated as Hitler's successor, had earlier sent a telegram asking whether he should assume leadership under a decree that authorized him to act if Hitler became incapable of governing. Although Göring later claimed he had merely followed legal procedure, Hitler interpreted the message as another attempt to seize power before his death. Within only a few days, two of the most powerful figures in Nazi Germany had fallen from favor. The circle surrounding Hitler grew even smaller. Those who remained inside the bunker now consisted almost entirely of individuals who had decided they would not leave Berlin alive. During the early hours of April 29th, Hitler summoned several members of his staff for an unexpected ceremony. After more than 16 years together, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun were married inside the bunker. The ceremony itself lasted only a few minutes. A city official conducted the civil marriage according to German law. Martin Bormann and Joseph Goebbels served as witnesses. Outside, artillery shells continued exploding across Berlin while Soviet infantry advanced street by street toward the Reich Chancellery. The contrast bordered on the surreal. Above ground, one of history's largest urban battles raged only a short distance away. Below ground, a small wedding ceremony proceeded beneath reinforced concrete walls. After signing the marriage register, the newlyweds briefly joined several staff members for a modest celebration. Champagne was served. Those present later recalled polite conversation rather than joy. Everyone understood what would follow. The marriage represented not the beginning of a shared future, but the final act of a relationship that had existed largely outside public view throughout Hitler's political career. Soon afterward, Hitler began dictating two important documents. The first was his political testament. The second was his personal will. His secretary, Traudl Junge, sat at her typewriter while Hitler spoke slowly, pausing occasionally to gather his thoughts. The political testament reflected many of the beliefs he had expressed throughout the war. He continued blaming Germany's defeat on betrayal, international conspiracies, and military failures, rather than accepting responsibility for the catastrophic decisions that had brought the Third Reich to ruin. He dismissed surrender as unacceptable and urged future generations to continue what he described as Germany's struggle. Modern historians generally view the testament less as a realistic political document than as evidence that Hitler remained unwilling to acknowledge the true causes of Germany's defeat. His personal will dealt with practical matters. He formally appointed Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as President of Germany, while Joseph Goebbels became Reich Chancellor. The appointments reflected the collapse of Hitler's inner circle. Göring had been dismissed. Himmler had been branded a traitor. Few senior leaders remained whom Hitler still trusted. Copies of these documents were entrusted to couriers instructed to escape Berlin and deliver them to German authorities outside the city. Several attempted the dangerous journey through Soviet lines. Some succeeded, others disappeared during the fighting inside the bunker. Military conferences continued even after the testament had been completed. General Hans Krebs delivered increasingly grim reports. Soviet troops had entered central Berlin. The Reichstag area faced constant attack. German defenders were running dangerously low on ammunition. Telephone communication with many units had ceased entirely. The government district itself would soon become the front line. Hitler nevertheless refused suggestions that he attempt escape. Several officers believed a breakout towards southern Germany might still be possible using armored vehicles under cover of darkness. Others proposed flying him from Berlin while small airfields remained barely operational. Hitler rejected every proposal. He had already made his decision. He believed capture by the Soviet Union would result in public humiliation similar to what had happened to Benito Mussolini only days earlier. The Italian dictator had been captured by partisans. executed, and his body displayed publicly in Milan. Hitler repeatedly stated he would not allow the same fate to befall him. On the morning of April 30th, life inside the bunker followed its familiar routine despite the extraordinary circumstances. Staff members continued working. Telephone operators attempted to maintain communications. Messengers hurried through corridors carrying reports. Meals were prepared as usual, yet everyone sensed the end had arrived. Hitler met briefly with several secretaries and staff members. He thanked many for their service. Witnesses later described him as noticeably calmer than during previous days. The emotional outbursts that had characterized earlier military conferences had largely disappeared. Instead, he appeared resigned. Around midday, Hitler ate his final meal. As on most occasions, it was vegetarian. Afterward, he retired to his private quarters with Eva Braun. Before entering the room, Hitler shook hands with several members of his staff. Some later recalled the moment vividly because they understood it would be their final meeting. Others remained uncertain whether he might still emerge with new instructions. The bunker corridor fell unusually quiet. Outside, Soviet artillery continued pounding central Berlin. Sometime during the afternoon, a gunshot echoed through the private apartment. After waiting several minutes, Martin Bormann and Hitler's valet, Heinz Lynch, entered the room. They found Adolf Hitler dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Eva Braun had taken poison, following Hitler's explicit instructions. The bodies were carried upstairs through the emergency exit into the garden of the Reich Chancellery. The journey itself proved extremely dangerous. Soviet shells continued landing nearby. Several men helped carry the bodies into a shell crater just outside the bunker entrance. There they poured gasoline over them. Approximately 180 to 200 liters had been gathered despite severe fuel shortages. The bodies were set alight. Those present stood briefly at the bunker entrance and offered silent salutes before returning underground as artillery fire intensified. The cremation remained incomplete. Repeated shelling prevented prolonged attention to the fire. Nevertheless, Hitler's instructions had largely been fulfilled. He had intended to prevent his body from becoming a Soviet trophy back inside the bunker. An extraordinary situation developed. Although Hitler was dead, the administrative machinery continued operating for several more hours. Orders still required signatures. Communications still functioned intermittently. Senior officials debated how long Berlin could continue resisting. Joseph Goebbels immediately assumed the role assigned to him in Hitler's testament. Yet he understood the position was essentially meaningless. The government no longer controlled Germany. It barely controlled several city blocks. General Krebs attempted one final diplomatic effort. During the early hours of May 1st, he crossed Soviet lines under a flag of truce and met General Vasily Chukov, commander of the Soviet 8th Guards Army. Krebs informed the Soviets that Hitler was dead. However, he lacked authority to offer Germany's unconditional surrender. Joseph Goebbels hoped negotiations might still produce acceptable terms. The Soviets insisted upon unconditional surrender exactly as the Allied governments had demanded for years. No agreement proved possible. Krebs returned to the bunker. The fighting continued. Inside, Joseph and Magda Goebbels reached their own tragic decision. Convinced they could not imagine life after National Socialism, they chose not to allow their 6 children to survive them. With the assistance of medical personnel, the children were given poison while asleep. Later that day, Joseph and Magda Goebbels left the bunker, where they died outside the entrance. Historical accounts differ on some details, but the consensus is that both died by suicide, and their bodies were subsequently burned by aides in accordance with their wishes. The bunker population rapidly dissolved. Martin Bormann prepared to escape. Military officers organized breakout groups hoping to reach German lines outside Berlin. Secretaries received permission to attempt escape if they wished. Some dressed in military uniforms for protection. Others carried false identity papers. Most understood the chances of success remained extremely small. During the night of May 1st and the early hours of May 2nd, numerous groups left the bunker separately. Several participants reached Western Allied lines after extraordinary journeys. Many others were killed or captured by Soviet forces during the fighting. Martin Bormann disappeared during one such breakout attempt. For decades, uncertainty surrounded his fate until forensic evidence established that he had died during the escape attempt near Lotte Station in Berlin. On the morning of May 2nd, organized German resistance inside Berlin finally collapsed. General Helmuth Weidling, commander of the Berlin defense area, ordered the city's remaining forces to surrender in order to prevent further unnecessary destruction. Soon afterward, Soviet soldiers entered the Reich Chancellery. They searched systematically through the shattered government buildings before discovering the bunker complex beneath them. The rooms they entered bore little resemblance to the Grand Command Center imagined by Allied propaganda. Instead, investigators found narrow corridors, modest offices, damaged furniture, abandoned documents, personal belongings, military maps, communication equipment, and unmistakable signs of hurried evacuation. The headquarters from which Hitler had directed Germany's final months had become an abandoned underground shelter. Soviet investigators immediately began searching for proof of Hitler's fate. The incomplete remains recovered from the garden underwent extensive forensic examination. Dental records, prepared with the assistance of Hitler's dental staff, became the primary method of identification. Modern historical research overwhelmingly supports the conclusion reached by those investigations. Adolf Hitler died by suicide inside the Führerbunker on April 30th, 1945. Despite this, rumors and conspiracy theories appeared almost immediately. Stories claimed Hitler had escaped by aircraft, submarine, or secret tunnel before fleeing to Spain, Argentina, or elsewhere in South America. No credible historical evidence has ever supported these claims. Decades of archival research, forensic analysis, Soviet records released after the Cold War, and investigations by historians from multiple countries all point to the same conclusion. Hitler never escaped Berlin. The bunker itself survived the war. During the following decades, Soviet and East German authorities partially demolished sections of the complex and covered much of the site to discourage it from becoming a place of pilgrimage. Construction projects altered the surrounding landscape, and for many years almost nothing visible indicated what had once existed beneath the ground. Today, visitors standing near the former Reich Chancellery site see an ordinary section of modern Berlin. A simple informational display explains the history of the location. There are no grand monuments, preserved command rooms, or dramatic museum reconstructions beneath the streets. The decision reflects Germany's determination to remember the crimes of the Nazi regime without glorifying its leaders or turning the bunker into a shrine. Inside Hitler's last operational headquarters, the Third Reich did not end with one dramatic battle or a final military victory. It ended in cramped concrete rooms filled with failing telephones, exhausted staff officers, impossible orders, and leaders confronting the collapse of the dictatorship they had built. The bunker protected its occupants from bombs for a time, but it could not shield them from the consequences of years of catastrophic political and military decisions. What remained at the end was not the image of an all-powerful empire, but a small underground headquarters isolated beneath a ruined capital, where one of history's most destructive regimes finally collapsed under the weight of its own ambitions, leaving behind only abandoned corridors, scattered documents, and a cautionary reminder of how absolute power can end in absolute ruin.